So with the challenges, kind of like the philosophy of these is we're not treating them like a normal exercise where we kind of like go back and diagnose every little thing. Because oftentimes challenges are like a work in progress because we do time box them to a certain amount of time. So it's kind of like, get as much done as you can, run into obstacles, run into challenges and whatnot. And then you're able to kind of like put a pin in it and come back to the challenge later, as challenges have a lower priority than exercises. But we do like just to have a little check-in, just like on the teacher's code. So go ahead and do that. So in our app.tsx, we are basically, importing in this hot button component that's been created, and we are giving it a label prop and a value of hot button. And so this probably over-engineered for this example because the button text always stays hot button. I don't know that, this is something that we would necessarily need to do. So if you're thinking through like, you know, maybe isn't there a better way just to call this hot button and not have to deal with like the props and whatnot. If this was all our app was ever meant to be, then yeah, I'd probably just um, write out the code, hard code that text within the button. But because in a big scheme of React, perhaps in a bigger application, you might have several different hot buttons within your app. It's hard to think of a website that would necessarily like have this functionality where users just clicking and changing colors, but perhaps that was our app. And we were using a hot button all over the place and we wanted to have different labels, then yeah, totally appropriate to have some sort of um, label that could be passed in. The real work of this exercise is done in the hot button. And so we'll kind of just do like a superficial walkthrough of this code is that we came up with some general JSX, if you're doing the design of like, okay, having some sort of div wrapping your button. And then the button is going to be where we like receive our label prop, where we evaluate the JavaScript type script. And then some sort of like p tag to just be our label for the amount of clicks. Something that we would need to do, obviously, for this exercise is to give user visual feedback on how many clicks that have happened and also track the color that we could change our button is we need to have state to do that. So we imported in use state at the top of our file, and then we set that default value to 0. So clicks has a value of 0. So when this component first renders, clicks is that value of 0 right there. And then most likely you all, before, building in like functionality of the clicks, might have toyed around with the state, and like when the state changes to 3, that's when we hit like our next conditional in this function that we haven't talked about yet. But hopefully kind of like that would be the process where I would do things is after I get the design, I would go through and start updating the state. One of the things that we did is we had to figure out how to change the color of the button, and the general approach would be to have some sort of like default styling that should be on there from a class name, such as like hot button. So hot button is where we kind of if y'all went with like the CSS that was given out as kind of like a template to build off of, we established like the font size, the padding it might have, and the border. So that's by default, where the button's always going to keep that shape, or that would be like the goal. Um, and then we need to figure out like, okay, how do we decide to give it that, that purple background or light purple? How do we determine that like that button text started off as white and then it transitioned to that like darker gray color? And so that's where we had to work with like, okay, what are our classes that are available? And again, these could have been written from scratch, but with these classes being available, essentially we're saying, this is, I'm sure you all are familiar with this in VS Code. You can hover over classes if you're like, what is this supposed to be? So this is saying class hot button. So any element with the class of hot button, this is going to target. If we have the dot, what this means if we hover is that any element that has these two classes, HotButton and cold, we'll get this styling, which is different than if we had a space. If you have a space, you can hover over it. And this is saying that we're actually targeting this element with the class cold that is a descendant that has some sort of parent grandparent wrapper with the class of HotButton. So just a reminder that VS Code um, gives us that little visual interface, which I love. This really helps me like understand like what element I'm targeting. So that's sort of the challenge is how do we make sure we are applying the right class? So essentially cold, cool, tepid, or warm to our button. And so the approach in the teacher's solution is to basically have this can be done a number of different ways. I saw your approach. I didn't see anything wrong with it at first glance. We just have this variable temperature class. So constant temperature class is our variable. Its value is the result of the return value, if we remember code reading. So the result of the return value of get temperature class is being assigned to the variable temperature class. So when this gets called, every time the component renders, we're going to go through these different if statements. And so if when our component renders, if click is 0, 1, or 2, then this is true. And so we return cold. So hot button and cold. You know, if clicks is 3 or greater, then we're going to return cool, and so on. Another approach that could have been taken, getting away from like the using like a function, like the teacher solution or like you did, Trey, which is again totally right way to go, is we could have just somehow uncomment this out, is we could have basically created some sort of variable temperature class, so hot button and temperature class, and then basically walked through a number of if-else statements to once we find that match, we're setting temperature class to either cold, cool, tepid, warm, hot, or nuclear based on whatever the state is, and then evaluate that expression right here to get cold, cool, tepid, warm, hot, and nuclear, and so on. So instead of using a function, an elaborate set of if-else statements could have worked as well. And so that's pretty much the gist of it for this exercise. Of course, there's the updating of the state. So when someone clicked on a button, this function fired right here, where we updated clicks by a value of 1. This could have been done function, handle click, and it's going to be set clicks to clicks plus 1. And then we could have just called handle click, and that would be appropriate. Like that would be an appropriate path as well. What's nice about seeing this alternative approach is I think we talked about like if we were to just do set clicks and do clicks plus 1, from what we learned on the junior side, this would just fire off right away. We wouldn't wait for the user click. So the way we keep this as a function definition and not a function call is by turning this into an arrow function. So now this sits as a function definition, waiting for a click event to call, and then we run the code, set clicks plus 1. So that's actually helpful because there will be times where you're going to need to pass in some values. And if you don't have that kind of like up above in an area like this, you're kind of like, how do I pull that off without automatically running it before the user event has occurred? So yeah, that's just like a general overview of this exercise. Any thoughts or questions? I know you came in late. I got this recorded as something you can refer to, but open space as well. In the off-topic channel, I did drop this instructor solution with comments, so you all can kind of like refer to that as well as a resource. Uh, cool. Um, so our next thing we're going to work on is actually another challenge, and this was just released. It's the React toggle switch, and I'll go ahead and do a demo of what we're going to try to create. Drag this over here and refresh. Might take a second. It is telling me that it's running at 5173. When in doubt, open a tab again. There you are. Um, so the functionality is we're going to recreate something like this that has like basically a toggle switch. We're in the off position, and the main design goals, if we're talking about like design, what metrics should we hit, is some sort of outer. This will probably be a div, some sort of outer container that'll have some sort of border radius on it. You're gonna have some sort of inner div that's probably gonna be your border radius is gonna be full, making it a circle. And the functionality is that when someone, I think if they click on either portion, yeah, if they click on either portion, whether they click on this little nodule, this tab, or the empty space, it's gonna switch from this off state to an on state. So you should have a text for whether it's on or off that changes based on the state. And the background should change from some sort of grayish color in an off state to a greenish color if you're working with the on state if you're on. This exercise is like just doing that CSS is you can kind of your brain is probably already kind of like maybe percolating like, okay, how do I get a container, and have it just these edges curved, and how do I get like that full circle to be within it? Like how should I structure my HTML and whatnot and classes? And so this exercise, just like the last one, is going to have a pretty good like problem breakdown. So I would heavily focus on this section. Imagine like a senior dev is giving you a broad outline and thinking like, can I build from here? And in the problem breakdown, there's steps within the problem breakdown to make that a little bit bigger. So I give yourself some time to really kind of like absorb that. Imagine someone, is talking to you, giving you this direction and think like, okay, can I build from this point? If you can't, which is a totally fair place to be, then you'd walk through the detailed tips section. And this is where, again, with building with anything in React's the general flow is we start with the layout, the JSX. Then we start to, whether through hard coding or using state, start to make some changes in the text editor to kind of simulate what will eventually be user functionality of clicking on, the tab to turn it on or off. And so each of those have some pretty detailed steps, such as the HTML, because you might be thinking like, okay, the JSX, where do I even get started? How should I think of it? Um, you're given some direction that you should probably build JSX that's going to essentially look like this. And it looks like Robert, who created this exercise, he even has class name in here. So this is basically, this isn't just valid HTML, this is valid JSX, which is cool. So now you can, so again, like try to struggle with doing this, with doing the layout yourself for a few minutes. And then if you're just like, I'm not even sure how to begin, um, jump into this and compare like its approach of like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So this, I've got like an outer div. Okay. Slider. So this must be that circle that's going left and right. So um, that's or actually the slider. How would I think of this? We've got the label to the right, and then oh, I guess toggle switch. So this is good. This is kind of learn as we look at code. Toggle switch holds the slider, so the longer oblong circle um, right here, and it holds the label as well. So it's holding both of those. And then inside of the slider, that oblong circle is the switch, which would make sense because that switch needs to go, on either side of that. And so you could probably just plug in this JSX and it's going to give you that rough skeleton that you need. And then Robert has a suggested CSS that would go along with that and pull it off. So um, you could I would say, spend some time trying to wrestle with the CSS to get things to move along and display as you would hope. But then there's no shame. This exercise for me, if I tried to recreate like the slickness of like how nice this looked in the CSS and whatnot, this would take me hours to do, like the CSS side of things. Like the React kind of like state and moving things to be on or off makes more sense, but like the preciseness of the CSS could be a full day's worth of work. So I'd encourage you not to get too hung up on that. But you could look through like the starter CSS, and I think you're totally welcome to use it. It's there for a reason. And you can kind of read through the logic. Okay, these elements are going to be display inline block, or these selectors. The slider, which is inside of ToggleSwitch. We're setting the width, the height on that, the vertical align middle, the border radius of 300. And you can even in VS Code, like again, when you hover over these, it'll show you which exact element you're targeting, and that'll help you see like the classes and styling that's being applied. It'd be hard to like, I think, come up with some of the slickness of the CSS by yourself. So I think it's a great idea to work with this CSS, but just keep in mind that it plays with this HTML. So if you come up with a different HTML with different class names, these two aren't going to play together. So then once you get, your layout done, then you can think through the state of, whether a button is in the on or off state, and hard code, being on, hard code being off, make sure that functionality works. The state is probably actually the easier part of this exercise. And then finally, even the events is you're just responding to a click to turn it on or off. So I think your real challenge is going to be conceptualizing the HTML and CSS and how this should work, and kind of like connecting those pieces together, which can be solved honestly with like copy and the paste, but we don't want to like skip the learning process if possible. So that said, we will I'll give a chance for any questions as well, but we'll work on this to lunch, and then we'll time box this 1:30 to 3 o'clock to work on, and then we'll do a review of the teacher solution somewhere around 3 before break. Um, as far as priorities, if you're not wrapped up with the hot button, this is a good time to do a commit on that. And then we'll move on to this new challenge. So everyone should be working on the React challenge or React toggle switch. Challenges have the lowest priorities of things. And the goal for these is even if you don't finish, you're getting your brain churning, and then you can return to like in the evening or this weekend, comparing it with the teacher solution, and you can kind of continue working on these without them slowing you down before moving on to the next thing. So yeah, any thoughts or questions or clarification I can offer? Cool. All right, well, go ahead, dive in. Reach out if any questions come in along the way. I'll probably reach out to y'all sometime post lunch just to see how you're doing, seeing if you have any blockers. But definitely feel free to preemptively message me if anything comes up as well, and we'll connect then. All right, yeah, let's jump into things. And I know this is a might still be a work in progress. So, in the off-topic channel, I've dropped the solution code with some comments. So anything we kind of maybe gloss over too fast in here, you can definitely refer back to that. It basically just has this toggle switch component that we're gonna look at. So it'll take for granted that we have app TSX set up a certain way and index.css set up a certain way. So in the index.css, and you all might have there's a number of ways of bringing in CSS into your application, right? You could do something called CSS modules and create a file, um, toggle switch.css, and you can put all your classes in there, and then you can just import that into toggle switch. So putting everything in index.css is just kind of, we know this code, this file is globally available, so we're kind of putting code in there. But to avoid running into like naming conflicts as your app got bigger, you might want to do CSS modules. Style components is something else that's out there. Chances are, in the first half of the course, you might have run across like Tailwind and using utility classes. So there's a few ways to handle our CSS. For now, I just have it in index.css. Um, the main thing that will stick out if we've applied everything correctly is going to be this is on class that we're going to add. We're going to need that for our functionality. That's going to change our toggle positioning and our color. So we'll come back to that in a second. So in app.tsx, we are importing in ToggleSwitch from ToggleSwitch.tsx. So in the same directory. You could have done all this work in app.tsx. It would just be fine because obviously if this was all our app was ever doing, there's no need to, have this sit in some other component. But this would be a weird item to just create a whole product around. So we're kind of imitating that this is probably a component that's being used somewhere in our app. So in ToggleSwitch.tsx, chances are you got started with creating the JSX, the design of the page, and we did kind of set you up where if you did look in a deeper dive in the instructions of how we'd probably want to set this up, that you probably want a div that's going to surround this whole oblong circle and this span with our label. And so we have some styling for our ToggleSwitch class that you could go back and look at index.css. Hopefully, if you were using that styling and using this default JSX, that you were kind of going back and forth and looking at the classes and how they were affecting the actual layout of your page. So again, within that div, we have this oblong circle with our switch within it, and then its other sibling is a span. So they're sitting side by side. Our styling took care of like what this oblong shape looks like under the slider class, and our styling gave us the shape of this switch, like how it gets its size. So that all comes from the CSS being applied, and then our label gets its styling from the state label class. So one of the things we want to do is we wanted to be able to track if with the label if the state of our toggle switch is on or off and kind of display that visually. And so one way to do that would be, because we know we're going to need state, is getting started with that state. So this approach makes sense to me that we're going to, for an on-off button using a Boolean that's going to be true or false, makes sense to me as like I think the smoothest route to take. So we're importing in use state, and we are giving it an initial Boolean value of false. This is probably just because like if the design is suggesting that we're in an off state, seems like the way to go. And so we're assigning that to our default value of is on, so it's going to be false. And then we have our setter, and the setter updates the value of is on if we call it. So for our label, you probably could have tested this out with like hard coding on and off, just to make sure that like, okay, that styling looks good and whatnot, but then we want to make it responsive to our state. And so one approach to do that would be to try to think through like, how do we get the logic of whether to show the string on or whether to show the string off? You could use some if-else statements to do this, but I think a pretty smooth way is just to use a ternary operator. So a ternary operator, just to refresh, is that we have an expression on the left-hand side, and if that's true, then whatever's on the right-hand side of the question mark, immediately to the right of the question mark, is assigned to a variable label. If is on is false, like it is with our initial state, then we take the value that's immediately to the right of the colon, the string off, and we assign that to label. And so label in our JSX, we evaluate that expression that it's going to be either the string on or the string off. So let me save this. So that should be all caps, off or on. And then what I would do is I'd then experiment, and chances are you all did this, of like before we get like the user functionality of clicking on things, you probably want to just work on hard coding state changes. So if I change this to true, does my label change? It does. False, our label's changing. It is taking a moment to update. Um, the other area that we are needed to come up with basically some have our state affect things is this div with the class name of ToggleSwitch. So that hopefully as you're reading through the CSS, you might have saw that like, okay, this at the very end of all of our classes, there's this class ToggleSwitch that looks like it's going to toggle or target an element with the class slider that's a descendant of an element with a class that has ToggleSwitch and is on. And if that's true, then we want to change the background color of that slider class to green. And we also want to do something with the switch. So the above affects the background of the slider, so this area in back. And then the below one, this one right here, affects the position with the transform property of shifting it 1.5 reps. And so that's getting that functionality for us. So one of the ways you probably could have tested this out with hard coding is before you kind of like brought in state, I would have tried just bringing in that class is on. Save it. There we go. That seems to be what I'm looking for. Now, if I don't have it, okay, that seems to be what I'm looking for. If it's not there, then that button should be where, or the toggle should be where it is, and the background should be gray. Again, if it's on, then we should see the background of green applied to slider and the translate X of 1.5 rem applied to the switch. So then we just think through, okay, cool, I hard coded that and I can see like, okay, that's how my code visually responds to things. And so now I want to link it to the state. And that's where kind of taking the same logic, right? Because we want to determine, do we show is on or show nothing? And so we can do that with a ternary operator. So based on our state, if on is true, then we're going to do immediately what's on the right-hand side. We're going to assign this is on string to modifier class. If is on is false or default state, then we're going to apply this essentially this empty string to a modifier class. And that's how we can then make this a little bit more dynamic. And then Trey, as we talked about, you could do all that logic inside of here. So this logic could just be placed inside of here. So it's some teams might prefer like, hey, do as many calculations as you can outside of the JSX so it doesn't get too cloudy. But for something as small as just this logic right here, I think it's readable and I think it's just fine. So we got that modifier class. And then what I would do again, we're kind of thinking like before I did the click functionality, I want to just test this out with the state, manually changing it. So true. Sweet, it slides it. So the get the green background and the translate X. Perfect. If it's false, it's going to bring it back to gray and to the left-hand side. So having done that, I feel like, okay, I've got a good feel for having implemented the JSX. It seems like I've implemented the state correctly, and now I just need to add that functionality. And so that's all this line is doing right here, is on this outermost div. And we could have maybe been more specific. The design wasn't totally clear, but you could have had the div. Maybe you only wanted this to work if someone actually clicked on that small circle on that toggle, in which case we would just have this on click on the div with the class of switch, I would assume would satisfy what we need to do. But by wrapping both the slider and actually the slider, the switch, and the label, we can actually click on the label too. And typically for like, yeah, accessibility, it's usually that's not a bad idea to have labels that you can click on because like usually any form, your input has a label, and if you click on the label, it'll take you to that specific input. So yeah, I think that's probably actually the design choice of why that's done like that. Um, but anyway, so all we do is we just have this function definition, right? Because we have the opening curly braces and the the big arrow. That means that this whole thing is a function definition. So if we didn't have that, then we would be trying to call the opposite of is on like immediately, and that's not what we're going for. We want to pass in an argument for set is on. Alternatively, and I won't spend our time on it, but we could have done a handle click and done a function handle click and updated the logic here. Set is on to the opposite of is on. There. I said I wasn't going to do it, and I did it. Yeah, Trey.
So I did the function handle click. I mean, is there a time when you do or do not use either one?
Yeah. So, rule of thumb is that if it's a simple like one-liner, doing that logic in here is completely fine. But if you found that like you were needing to do like, if something um blah 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 and then const something equals func like you have all this stuff going on inside of a code block. There's no way you'd be able to put that inside of this on click code. So I think the rule of thumb is that if you're doing something that is like a one line like this, like what we're doing right here, then you're safe to go ahead and put it in an on click. You don't have to. And that's going to come down to a team preference. So whatever team you're on, they might say like, hey Trey, code works, but like our style guide says if something is one line, we just want to do that work inside of here. So I think some of it's up to your team. The rule of thumb is that if you have more than one line of logic that you need, I would definitely just have a function definition to do that. Does that make sense? Sweet.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for explaining that.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Yeah, so that's all we got for this exercise. Again, there was a lot of CSS. If you had to do the CSS, like I feel like that could have been like several hours, but that's not necessarily what the challenge was about. Um, so any thoughts or questions before we take a look at our next exercise? Sweet. Well, React to lists is what's coming up next, and React List is just going to be about mapping arrays of data to React components. So basically, there's going to be times where you're going to get, you all know from a front-end project, you got data from a third-party API, and it wasn't all, your data structures can vary, but typically it was like an array of elements. It might have been an array of objects, an array of strings, or arrays can hold anything, but it was an array of elements. And so there's going to be time in React that you're going to get an array of data, and you're going to want to loop over each piece in that data and use that data to display it in some sort of way, create a component for each element in the data. And so that's where map is gonna take us. So the resources section I think is worth taking a look at in the official React documentation. And that's what I'll kind of actually use to kind of just guide us with a quick introduction to this. This exercise will talk about filter too. That's good extra information. There's gonna be times in the future where you want to like filter data as well. But don't for this exercise, you just need to have a grasp of how we're going to use the map method. So I would say that if you even get down to, in regards to this documentation, you could stop just short of filtering arrays and items, unless you just had curiosity. So I'll go ahead and just kind of take you all to an example. And let's imagine that we have this variable people. Let's imagine that this is coming from some third-party API, right? So you queried, the Pokemon API or whatever, and it gave you back an array. And in this case, it's an array of strings. And you want to do something with that. And actually, let's go up here. Let's imagine we're getting that we're hitting that third-party API, and we're getting an array of strings. And our goal is to basically, within an unordered list, we want to be able to loop over that data, whether it came from an API or whether, for your own final projects, you're going to create your own database and query your database and hit an endpoint and get that data. But regardless, you've got an array of strings, and you want to loop over that array that you got back from an API or your own database. And as you're looping over that array of strings, that data, you want to turn each element into a list item. And that's what map will allow us to do. So let's go down here and I'll kind of just like walk through it. Okay, here we go. So the goal is I want to have a UL. And right now it's giving me an error because we don't have any content in here. Let me. Sorry, just for the sake of my brain. Oh my gosh, someday I will learn how to code. I was like, I knew something was wrong with that slash. Um, so basically, what we're doing is we want to basically create a LI for each of these items. So what we can do is say we are in JSX. So if we want to do any sort of evaluation, any JavaScript, any TypeScript type stuff, when we're in our JSX, we need to have curly braces, right? That means we're going to evaluate an expression. So we're going to say people, because that's the name of our array. And I might just call this data, if y'all don't mind, just because we're kind of simulating it's coming from somewhere else. Data dot map. So if we're familiar with the map method is going to take each item in an array. So it's going to go one element, one string at a time, and we give it a name. So let's do this. Let's name this a little bit better. People. I think that's literally what it was before. My apologies. Um, people is our array, and we create our own variable name. So usually the singular of people, is person. So person is going to represent each item in our array. And then map lets us basically do something to each of those elements. And so what we want to do is for each of these persons, we want to create a list item, so JSX, and we want to evaluate what person is. And so we have basically taken our people array, and with map, we're looking at each person, each element, and for each element, we're returning a list item with the value of that specific element. In this case, it's the string. When we are doing this, when we are creating list items like this, we will get an error if we opened up the console of we need to give them a key. So there's a key prop, and we just have to set it to a unique value. So in this case, we just do something like person, because each person's name is unique here. And that's basically like the guts of what we're doing for this exercise is just starting to get a feel for taking some data, using the map method to transform each element in the array. And in this case, it's outputting some JSX. Now, some people, as I mentioned before, don't like to see that much code within the JSX. Um, Again, teams have different preferences. So we could do something like this, const people LIs equals uh, people dot map person, and then the same thing. So I didn't do anything extra there, anything different than what was already down there. And then just we would just evaluate people LIs. So as long as I didn't make a typo. Oh, there's an extra P right there. And misspelled people there. There we go. Um, so again, different teams might have different preferences. If it's a short one-liner, I think it's fine putting in the JSX. If it was going to be a longer amount of code, then I'd probably have it up above the JSX. So that's a soft introduction to list. You'll be doing something similar in that you are going to, in app.tsx, to take a look at our starter code. And I say that, yeah, Trey.
Just quick question before we move on to the starter code.
Yeah,
The key. Now, I understand using a key in a database, but using a
yeah,
key in an unordered list from an API, how does that correlate?
sure. Yeah, yeah. So the key is just for React purposes. React has something called like the virtual DOM. And so React needs to be able to keep track of our list items. Um, So that way, if you know in the future, if you have some functionality where you maybe remove an item from the DOM or whatever, or some sort of like delete functionality, that React knows how to keep them ordered in a certain order. Um, I will say that our linter will force you to use a key because it's like best practices. But if you don't use a key and you're working on a personal project and you don't have your linter going, React usually still does a good job of keeping track of things, but it's purely just for React's purposes and how they manage and organize the DOM.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Cool. So I did mention starter code, and I guess I do that facetiously because there really isn't any starter code. So again, we'll kind of from scratch, React intro, React JSX, you'll create a new React app. You'll gut out the app.tsx file, and we're only going to put this content in there. And the only thing you're going to do is you're going to output in a Pokemon list component. Your goal is to basically just do what I did. You're going to map over Pokemon, and you're going to use for the key, you'll probably set it to number, and then you'll evaluate the value of name to display that. So you'll have an unordered list with a number of list items within it, and so yeah, generally reproduce what I just did. Um, any thoughts or questions before I let you all kind of dive in and get started? Sweet. We're gonna go straight into break, or you can take a break whenever you all want. If we get the PRs in by 4:30, we'll go ahead and do a Q&A at 4:30. Um, if we don't, or maybe even like 4:40. Actually, I like to give you all a heads up. So yeah, if the PRs are in by 4:30, we'll do a Q&A. If not, we'll kick off tomorrow with a Q&A. So I'll let you all know regardless by 4:30 if we're gonna have a meeting or not. Sound good? Sweet. All right, well, I'll let you all go.